This focaccia is so easy to make. Soft and fluffy inside, crispy on the outside, and you can put whatever toppings you want on it. It doesn't take long to make either, and it's absolutely delicious. So let's get started with the recipe. The first step is to activate the yeast. You're going to add 1 3/4 cups of warm water. Make sure it's not too hot because you don't want to kill the yeast. Then you add 2 teaspoons of maple syrup. You could also use sugar or honey. After that, we are going to add the yeast. This is dry active yeast. So we're going to add 2 1/4 teaspoons dry active yeast to this warm mixture. And then I'll just mix it around and give it some time to start activating. If you have instant yeast, you can actually skip this step and just go right into making the dough. You know that the yeast is alive if it starts to foam. Give it about 10 minutes. So I've sped it up there and it started to foam nicely. So I'm going to move on to the next step of making the dough. I'm adding 4 cups of flour. I'm not weighing out my flour here. I know that it's 500 grams, but the reason I'm not weighing it is because I know the texture that I need this to be at the end. But I would recommend, if you have a kitchen scale, to weigh it, because depending on how packed your flour is, you can end up using too much or too little. If you don't have a kitchen scale, try fluffing your flour up before measuring your cups. After the flour, I'm going to add some salt. Sometimes I use sea salt and sometimes I use coarse salt. This time I'm choosing to use coarse salt for no particular reason, really. So I'm adding 2 teaspoons of salt, and then I'm going to mix this all together into the wet ingredients. I want to make sure to thoroughly mix this. We need all of the flour to be fully moistened, and that way it'll rise appropriately. We also don't want any dry spots because that won't taste very well when we make the actual bread. The best part about this recipe is it does not require any kneading, and I also don't do any stretch and folds, which most focaccia recipes ask you to do. I try to keep it very simple, keep it something that I will be able to accomplish within the day. So if I need to make this quickly in one afternoon, I can do that and know that it'll be ready for dinner time. So I wet my hands and I'm poking the dough so you can sort of see the consistency that you want it to be. It's a fairly sticky dough, but it's not sticking to my hands because I have water on them. Once you have that completed, put some saran wrap on top of it and let it sit for at least 2 hours. Normally what I like to do, especially if I need to speed up the process, I will put it on my stove when I'm using my oven. Or if you're not using your oven, you could turn your oven light on and put it in the oven. That way it'll be a little warmer and the heat helps it to rise a lot quicker. There are many different types of toppings you can put on focaccia. I like to put tomatoes and garlic. Sometimes I find keeping it simple is just the best combination. So I'll cut up some garlic here. This is some homegrown garlic. And I also jarred diced tomatoes. These are San Marzano tomatoes. I jarred them about a month ago, and now this is the first jar I'm actually opening up to use. Aside from the tomatoes and garlic, I will also add some basil, fresh basil, and some oregano. Focaccia is something that I've been making for a couple of years now. My husband grew up eating his nonna's focaccia, so it's sort of like a family tradition that I want to pass on. I don't think my focaccia really lives up to hers, but I do try my best, and he is very pleased with it. There really are so many different ways to make this classic Italian flatbread, and even depending on where you are in Italy or where people came from, they may make it differently. There's not one way that's more right than another. Anything that your family enjoys is definitely the right way. I'm chopping up a lot of garlic here. I think I've come to realize that this is too much garlic. My kids also don't like too much garlic on the focaccia because it's a little spicy for them. Sometimes I save a section and put just a tad on it, so that way they will be more likely to eat it. The next step is to put parchment paper on a baking tray. Once the dough has risen enough, it's ready to use, so it has at least doubled in size at this point. I put a good amount of olive oil down on the parchment paper, and now I'm going to transfer the dough to it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just moving my hand around the sides of the bowl to detach the dough from the bowl, and I'm slowly going to let it fall onto the parchment paper. I put my hand in the olive oil earlier, or my fingers, I should say, so that the dough won't stick to them. I transferred it to the parchment paper, and now I'm going to shape it. So make sure you have a good amount of olive oil, about a quarter cup there. Here I give you a bit more in detail how I fold it. So it doesn't have to be such a daunting task. I know this is what people really see as being the most challenging part. I just make an envelope fold, so I'll fold two sides in, then the other two sides, and then I flip it over. At this point, the dough is going to be very tight. It's going to be hard for me to spread it out. I'm doing what I can here to try and spread out the dough, but I'm going to have to give it some time for it to relax. So what I do is I walk away from it for about 5 minutes. I let the dough settle, and with time, it'll become a lot easier to spread out. I do this a couple times as well. So I think I walked away from it twice and then came back and tried to spread it out even further. Depending on how hot or cold your house is, with it being a warmer temperature, it will happen a lot sooner where it relaxes. If it's colder, it may take the dough a bit longer for it to relax enough so that you can spread it out to all the edges and corners of the cookie sheet. Once it finally reaches that optimal size, you can let it rest there so it has time to rise. Leave it for at least 15 minutes. If your house tends to be a cooler temperature, I would give it at least half an hour then. If your house is warmer, you can probably get away with 15 minutes. The next step is to add some good quality olive oil to the top. This is what will really help give it its crispy texture. And while you are putting the toppings on the focaccia, make sure to preheat your oven to 415 degrees. Now we are going to give it that dimpled look that focaccia is so well known for. Because I already put the olive oil on the top, it's not going to stick to my fingers. I've also given it time to rise and rest, and so it's much less likely to stick. So I'm just going to press my fingertips into the dough so that there's a bunch of holes everywhere. I can't tell you the amount of times I've actually forgotten this step, and I've had to try to do it with some toppings on. Nevertheless, it always turns out all right. Now I'm going to add the tomatoes. So like I said, these are tomatoes that I canned. They are quartered and already in pieces. I'm just going to put them on the top of the pizza. I have used many different types of toppings before as well. I've added artichoke hearts, olives, onions. I've done more of a classic rosemary and garlic focaccia. You can become creative here and top the pizza however your family would like. On this day, I was making the focaccia to bring to a family dinner. But normally I would serve it as a side to steak or braised beef. It's really good with something that has a sauce for you to dip it in. And the best part is the leftovers we would have the next morning with some runny eggs, and it makes for a delicious breakfast or lunch. Here I'm adding the salt on top, so I always use sea salt for this part, and a good quality sea salt. And I make sure to put a good amount. It really absorbs the salt, and so do the tomatoes as well. So I make sure to really cover it and really evenly distribute it. Next, I'm going to add the dried oregano. Sometimes I also add some dried parsley, but on this day I did not. I sprinkle it all over. At this point, I have not added the garlic. I find that if I put the garlic on right at the beginning, it tends to overcook and burn. What I do instead is I cook it for about 15 minutes and then I'll take it out and I will add the garlic and the basil. I actually forgot to film myself adding the basil, but I did put it on in the end. And I'll also add some olive oil to it as well so that it turns out extra nice and crispy, just perfect how I like it. So you see me adding it here. And like I said, I chopped up way too much garlic, but don't worry, I'll use that in another recipe later on. So I'm going to take it now, make sure it's spread out evenly, and then I will put it back in the oven. I will set my timer for another 20 minutes. Everyone likes their focaccia cooked to a different level. So I like it to be a bit crispier on the bottom, so I cook it a bit longer. But if you don't like it quite as crispy, then you could take it out 5 minutes earlier. Here I'm just cutting it up. I'm using a pizza cutter. I actually should have used my other pizza cutter that I use when I make my pizzas in my wood burning oven, but I couldn't find it at this point, so I sort of struggled to cut it with this pizza cutter. It turned out delicious. It's nice and airy and fluffy inside. It's nice and crispy on the outside. I can tell you my whole family was very pleased that I decided to bring this to the party.